Hello and welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. 2023 brings a bit of political power shifting to Washington and some interesting activities in Ohio's political landscape. Joining us are Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes and Dr. David Jackson, the Bowling Green Department of Political Science. Dr. Jackson, it seems like we just finished a Senate race in Ohio, and yet already Sherrod Brown, who's the incumbent senator up for election in 2024, 2 years from now basically, already has an opponent. That race is already ramping up. So does that say something about Ohio, about its importance, or is this just somebody wanting to get first in the door and then get their name out there?
Well, it certainly says something about Ohio and its importance, but I think it also says something about our politics, which is that the next election begins, on election night of the previous election.
Wow.
So, the process of, the surfacing, the process of getting your name out there and getting fundraising started, demonstrating that you're a serious candidate, begins, it seems, earlier and earlier every year. So it's really not surprising that already a candidate has self-identified and put themselves forward. Senator Dolan running for Sherrod Brown's seat. Mm-hmm. And then also, I think there's been some movement on the Brown side with hiring some staff and indicating that they're going to make a go of it, because there had been some discussion as to whether or not Senator Brown would seek re-election, mm-hmm. whereas he hasn't announced that he is. The expectation certainly on the Democratic side was that he would. Right. Certainly the hope on the Democratic side is that he would, because he is the lone, as far as I'm aware, statewide, well, with the exception of the Supreme Court, I guess there might be a Democrat or two left over there, but in terms of the Senate seats and the executive branch, Democrats are few and far between in state government in Ohio. Right. And this is going to be a very interesting race, because on the one hand, it certainly looks like Ohio is losing its position as a swing state, a bellwether state, a competitive state. On the other hand, Tim Ryan, I would argue, overperformed in the 2022 election. So you could say Ohio in 2016 and 2020 was an 8-point state for Donald Trump, so an 8-point Republican state. But I think the final numbers showed that Tim Brown lost by maybe 6 points. So it's not exactly a dramatic overperformance. But when you factor in the fact that the National Democratic Party largely abandoned his campaign, which was certainly not to his benefit, despite the fact that he tried to make it to his benefit by pointing out that showed him to be independent and not a party man. The fact of the matter is, not having that money that went into places like Pennsylvania certainly could have been more beneficial in Ohio. Right. So I think the Democrats are going to be looking closely at Ohio in 2024. But they do have a problem, which is they are defending a larger number of states in 2024, because as we know, 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So even though the Senate's terms, of course, are 6-year terms, a third of the body is elected. So it's staggered terms in office, brought to us by the founders. So the fact is, in 2024, the Democrats are going to have to raise a boatload of money nationwide and do some serious thinking about what races they're going to focus on or not. And there's probably more data saying Ohio might not be worth focusing on than there is data saying it should be focused on, except for the fact that the candidate who is in all likelihood the Democratic nominee, Senator Sherrod Brown, is an incumbent who has shown the uncanny ability among Democrats to win statewide here.
Yeah, and when you look at that, of course, obviously the Senate, very, very narrow margin right now for the Democrats, and they've had one Democratic U.S. Senator in Arizona become an independent. And I already see that she has a Democratic primary opponent, it appears, unless she chooses to run as an independent there. So, yeah, Ohio would seem to be one place. But then, as you said, they looked at Tim Ryan's campaign and went, he doesn't have a chance. It'd be odd if they did that to Sherrod Brown, seeing as how he's been there for so long, as you said, bucked the trend of being a statewide elected Democrat in a state that doesn't look fondly on that sort of thing right now.
Well, it's always easy to look back and second guess the decisions that were made during a campaign, because it's like when you watch poker on TV and you can see the hands, you know that the person making the decision is making a right or wrong decision. Right. The people on the table don't know that. The people making the decisions during, at the Democratic Senate campaign committee had to look and say, where are we likely to win? Where do we have a chance? What does the data tell us? I would push back a little on that and say, did that last 5 million, 10 million that went into Pennsylvania really make the difference when that state was actually, close, but ultimately not that close?
Right.
Could that 5 million or 10 million have made a difference in Ohio? Because what we saw late in the election in 2022 was essentially a tie race. And then over the last couple of weeks of the campaign is when the significant divergence happened, and it ended up being a 6-point race for J.D. Vance.
Yeah. And I noticed I was looking today because I was looking at how things had performed, and Tim Ryan, Northeast Ohio, actually what the districts he represented, he narrowly lost in those, had he probably, which is kind of interesting, which may point to what we're going to talk about, where is Ohio trending, because those used to be strong Democratic districts. Now they're obviously pink going red, and that may have cost him the election too. He didn't run well in his home area, which is kind of surprising.
Well, everybody has thoughts on what it's going to take to win in Ohio.
Yeah.
And a colleague of mine said, yeah, Tim Ryan didn't win those parts of Northeast Ohio in his district, but Sherrod Brown usually does.
Okay.
And other people are complaining and saying if the Democrats want to win in Ohio, they need to get turnout up in Cuyahoga County. Other people are saying if Democrats want to win in Ohio, they have to stop losing rural areas by the overwhelming majority that they're losing rural areas. If they could go from losing, some counties, 70-30 to 60-40, they could pick up some votes there. And if they could do so without alienating the base in other counties, that might be to their benefit. Yeah. So there's a lot of people after the election who have lots of ideas about what it should have happened in the last election, but because our cycles are so quick,
right.
It's not just second guessing, it's making decisions about what to do in the next election too.
Yeah, and as we said, the election's not until November of 2024 for that Senate seat, but the planning and the strategy almost is obviously started on election night when the polls closed on what's going to happen in that Senate race in 2024. When we look at Ohio a little bit, we're going to have to go to a break in a moment, but what we see, and you talked about that just now, that how can either party, because both of them want to find that center group of people. That's where you win. You can hold on to the extremes of your base, but you need to bring people from the center leaning towards you one way or the other. For the Democrats, that means rural issues, which they don't right now seems pretty a difficult thing. For the Republicans, obviously, it's metropolitan areas. They never get a lot of strength there, although if they do, then they benefit from that. So when we come back, we can probably talk a little about where Ohio's going and can either party find that center group, or do they need to? On one side, maybe the Republicans don't need to find a centrist population to appeal to. Back in just a moment with Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes and Dr. David Jackson here on The Journal. Thanks for staying with us on The Journal. Our guests are Dr. David Jackson and Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes of the Bowling Green State University Department of Political Science. Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, when we left that last segment, we were talking about the upcoming elections in Ohio, 2023, 2024, but the rules and things will be changing a little bit versus the way we voted in November of 2022. And plus, we still are going to try and figure out district-wise who's voting for whom and what district people are in and what's my district, who am I voting for, that kind of thing, because that's still all up in the air because of the redistricting fiasco that we sort of had. Although some people would say it worked out perfectly fine, other people would call it a fiasco. So
yeah, I think there's a couple things going on. So first, it's going to be our districts are probably going to change a little bit, even if the courts say they're no longer pursuing it, because previously our districts at the state legislative and congressional levels have all been declared unconstitutional by the Ohio courts. Even if the courts say they're going to drop them because we didn't get a supermajority when we made the districts, based on the constitutional amendments voters approved a couple years ago, we're going to be drawing new districts again before our 10-year window is up. So regardless, we're back in this mess very quickly. And I would argue that it was kind of a fiasco because it showed the nation that Ohio couldn't get it together. Regardless if it worked out for one of the parties or not, it didn't make Ohio politics look that great. And so that's kind of the first thing that's a little bit up in the air. The second thing is Mike DeWine signed a bill, so we now have a new law about what you need to vote and where you can vote and when you can vote. And so we've moved to a state with photo ID requirements instead of our previous long list of what you needed to do to prove yourself at the polls. And one of the big things it also did is it limited voting drop boxes to 1 per county, making those far less accessible in large counties. And so that, while that was a lawsuit was immediately filed about that, where that's going to end up is up in the air. And then the third thing is we're going to have a couple constitutional amendments coming down the pipe that voters need to vote on that are going to have huge changes or possible changes to what direct democracy looks like in Ohio and what citizens can have input on. And so I think these 3 things make our upcoming elections both really interesting, but also pretty complicated at a state level.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the fact that the democracy part of it, and because there is a move when it comes to citizens' initiatives to put it, you have to have 60% versus 50% for it to pass, or 51%, which has traditionally not been the way we've done it in Ohio. So an issue could pass with could get 51% of the vote and yet not actually go into effect. An amendment or a citizen, like for instance, like recreational marijuana gets on the ballot. If it only gets 51% of the vote under the rules that would go into effect, that wouldn't be enough.
So yeah, what essentially looks like it's coming down is there have been a couple different versions of this. And the basic idea is to move the threshold for citizen-led initiatives, which would change the Ohio Constitution, from a 50% plus 1 threshold to a 60% threshold. The original proposal said that only applied to citizen-driven initiatives rather than legislatively referred. The legislature took some heat, and so now it would apply to both. The thing to remember with those is you need broad support across the state to even get them on the ballot from many counties, and it's not, you need to show that support before you even get to the voting. Additionally, the majority of citizen initiatives that have passed in Ohio have had well over a 60% threshold. So this is kind of a solution in search of a problem. Most of what I have heard is the motivation for this is concern that a reproductive rights amendment would end up on the ballot. There has been a large movement for that, given how strict Ohio is in that regard and how many public incidents there have been of people not getting the care they need in Ohio. And so there's been a move for a reproductive rights amendment, and if the legislature can't squash that before it gets to the voters, it would likely pass with a 50% plus 1 threshold. And if they change that, it'll be a lot harder.
It'll be more difficult. Yeah, and it speaks to what I know we've talked about before, that as you said, it's a different approach to the way democracy is compared to other states where, and we've talked a little about Michigan, that they are actually more open to citizen activity and that sort of thing in terms of getting things on the ballot, passing them, whereas Ohio tends to be like pulling things back in closer to Columbus and making it more controlled as a centralized government. Is there a supposition as to why Ohio wants to move that way, or why suddenly we've decided to go that route versus the way other states have gone?
So I would argue the reason that we're moving that way is the legislature is out of step with the average voter in Ohio. The legislature is far to the right, and while there are a lot of people who are to the right in Ohio, the legislature is a lot further to the right than the average Ohioan. And Ohio is not a very, very dark red state. And we may not be as purple as we once were, but the state itself hasn't moved that far yet. And I think legislators can read the writing on the wall. If they want to preserve their power, they need to pull it back in. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of the policies that we're seeing right now, because the state just looks a little bit different than our legislature.
Yeah, and maybe it almost it implies in a way, and this is that the legislators don't trust the citizens to vote do the right thing. I guess that's probably an over generalization, but they don't trust them to vote the way the legislature thinks things should be going. Dr. Jackson, we talk about the fact that Ohio used to be a bellwether state. Whoever won Ohio won the presidential votes from Ohio, won the election, but now we're moving away from that a little bit, and that trend started not just in 2020, but actually began really back in 2016 a little bit. We started to see the fact that Ohio, although it did vote for Donald Trump and he got elected, it has moved more in that direction, more toward away from purple to red than it used to be. Is that a correct description of Ohio or not?
Well, I think what this conversation points to is, from a political science perspective, structures and processes matter. And so there's a tendency sometimes for people to think that, well, the people vote and then the government reflects, what the people want. And in a democracy, or to prevent cards and letters from coming, a republic, as our system here in Ohio is, the fact of the matter is that the choices that are made about how votes are counted, how districts are drawn, what it takes in order to pass, a constitutional amendment or to pass a piece of legislation, and lots of other factors have an effect on what the actual outcomes of the election look like. Basically, what it's boiling down to is a colleague of mine and I in our department, Dominic Wells, are working on this project, and increasingly what we're thinking about is the issue of the difference between the state in terms of all people in the state over 18 years old versus what the actual voters look like.
Okay.
And we're getting there on the idea, but what it boils down to is theoretically, if a republic is functioning properly, and everybody is equally empowered to vote, one would think that the electorate should very much look like the state overall.
Right.
But that's not the case. And it never has been, and it probably never will be.
Exactly sure.
Because there are certain individual factors that could lead a person to vote or not vote. Right. But structures can have a definite effect on that. And so what we've seen in Michigan with same-day voter registration and citizens commissions drawing legislative districts is a dramatically different set of outcomes that we're seeing in Ohio.
Yeah. And we come back, because we're going to go to a break here. Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, in essence, what we're talking about when you talk about these super margins instead of a 50+1, that in a way, and we can talk about this when we come back, that's in essence kind of diluting the value of your vote, because it isn't 1-to-1 anymore. You have to now achieve that higher level. So we come back, we can talk a little bit more about that, and then also want to talk a little about how the Ohio House is functioning these days and see what new things have gone on down there. Back in just a moment here on The Journal. You're with us here on The Journal. Our guests are Dr. Nicole Kalaf-Hughes and Dr. David Jackson, the Bowling Green State University Department of Political Science. Dr. Kalaf-Hughes, we talked a little about the fact that there may be this a majority vote wouldn't necessarily, in some cases in Ohio, mean you've won, whatever the issue or whatever is. Does that, in essence, make my vote count for less? Should that become the rule of law in Ohio?
I don't know if it would make your vote count for less.
Okay.
It would make the curve just a little bit steeper to getting things done. There's a lot of states in the U.S. that have some direct democracy components, and states all do it a little bit differently, whether it's constitutional amendments or whether it's laws. Every state looks a little bit different. Sure. What would, I think, make these changes, or at least these efforts, stand out in Ohio is, again, just the fact that this isn't an issue we've had. We don't really have a lot of efforts to amend the Ohio Constitution compared to a state like California, where some of their ballots have 17 different provisions, some of which conflict on them on a regular basis. And so Ohio is a little bit different in that regards, and I think a lot of this has to do with just uncertainty as to kind of where the state is going, and you see that reflected in what's going on in the Ohio House.
Yeah, and some of these things are going to be kicked around, and there may be, as you hear bits and pieces that, oh, someone has agreed in principle to maybe doing this or not doing that, and the Ohio House obviously got off to a roaring start, sort of reflective of the U.S. House and its discussion. What does that say about a party that holds a super majority, I mean a strong super majority, and yet even within their own party, which I know parties aren't monoliths, they're made up of all different kinds of people and ideas and representatives and things like that, but everybody assumed that the Ohio Republican Party would just like sail right through and these things would be pro forma, bang, 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 it'd get done. That doesn't seem to be the case, given that even something as basic as electing a speaker, which we know doesn't seem as basic as we used to think it was, that became an issue right out of the box. Day one, there was a discussion about who should really be speaker and who had actually won or not won, and how they won, and was it fair, and what kind of political skullduggery was behind all of that. So talk a little about the Ohio House right now, because they have to move forward and do things. They can't just keep arguing amongst themselves.
Well, that's kind of exactly the problem, is that without sorting this out, they've kind of been, it's been a slow start. And I think a lot of the reason that there has been so much disagreement over this is the fact that you do have a relatively broad Republican Party, though not super broad, but relatively speaking. And I think part of the party didn't necessarily expect a challenge from within. And I think what ends up happening is you end up having kind of backdoor deals and backdoor negotiations to try to get concessions. We saw it in the U.S. House, and the fact that there was such a narrow majority there allowed some of the more extreme elements of the party to get a ton of concessions that they wouldn't have gotten if the Republicans had a strong supermajority in the U.S. House. And I think in the Ohio House, it boiled down to a disagreement over rules and a disagreement over procedural rules. And I don't think the one wing of the party expected the other wing of the party to work with the opposition, to collaborate with the Democrats to get Democratic support. Because what they may have forgotten is that while you can be the most popular Republican, you still need to get a majority of the House to agree.
Right.
And if the Democrats went along with one of the competing factions, which is what happened, it wasn't probably what the party expected. And I think it will be interesting to see how they sort this out, because they will need to. And there are still pretty significant disagreements about the rules that were enacted and the procedures that were followed.
Well, it's almost interesting, and Dr. Jackson, you can weigh in this too, that it's interesting the narrow majority in the U.S. House led to that kind of pushing and pulling and negotiating, and yet having a supermajority didn't make it any easier, because then it seemed like then you could argue even more amongst yourselves about what the direction should be, and then you have a portion of the party, stepping across the aisle going, well, you may not like me that much, but you definitely don't like the other guy at all, so let's cut a deal and you'll get the lesser of two evils, and maybe in some people's minds. So is that typical of what goes on? Is that not unusual that these kind of deals get cut? We just haven't seen it out in front, I guess, in Ohio blatantly like this.
Well, I mean, due to the effects of gerrymandering, the Republicans in the state legislature in Ohio are a super majority, which is significant in terms of passing legislation if they can, get it together and pass legislation. The Democratic leadership in the House, it appears, has done the best they could with a terrible hand they've been dealt to try to use what leverage they had available to try to extract some concessions from the candidate who was not the majority vote getter among the Republican caucus, but in combination with all of the Democratic votes and the Republicans who supported him to produce. Now, there was no written deal that I've heard about. Well, I mean, there may or may not be, but I haven't seen whatever the written deal was. And there's a great deal of speculation about what it was, that it included keeping things like right to work from happening, or that it involved the drawing of, or at least a commitment to the concept of drawing fair districts. And we'll see as the legislature actually begins its session some hints as to what the deal might be, because what legislation actually comes forward will offer us evidence about what was agreed to and what wasn't. Which does bring up sort of the bigger point about policy, which is that to make a really simplistic point, Ohio is a great, big, complicated, interesting state with a giant economy and tens of millions. Well, what is it, 11 million people? If it were a country, it would rank, up there. Right. And there's a lot of work for a legislature to do in terms of making policy to keep this place functioning. Right. In full disclosure, the S in BGSU stands for state. So coming up in this next legislature, there has to be a biennium, which is the 2-year budget that the state has to pass. There's a huge amount of work to be done, and so while to make a point that sounds a little populist, I suppose, while the politicians are fighting it out about who's really the speaker, how many caucuses there really are, should only Christian prayers be allowed to initiate the legislature, should guns be allowed on the floor. There's a whole lot of important policy that has to be made to keep a place like Ohio running, and so hopefully at some point they'll get their act together and start thinking about ideas rather than just internecine strife.
Well, and you make a good point that meanwhile the day-to-day operations go on which affect people at every single hour of every day. And those kind of things are, to them, they're important, but they're not important. It's what.
And luckily, we have some talent in the executive side. You know,
Yeah.
you can be, take a partisan or bipartisan
Yeah.
or nonpartisan approach. And again, to make the educational point, there's a talented chancellor of higher education in the form of Randy
yeah.
Gardner, who's not alone in the state in terms of keeping the government function, sort of while the
Yeah.
legislature is out there kicking each other
Yeah.
around. There are some adults who
Still in
manage
the room.
to keep the state functioning.
That's a good thing. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Obviously, as this story plays out over the next few months, we'll see what the deals were or were, and what direction the state's going to go. Because obviously we're going to be important in 2024 just simply because of the Senate race. We believe, although you're saying that might not be the case. Well, I guess we'll see how that plays out too. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and you can watch us every Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. on WBGU PBS. We will see you again next time. Good night and good luck.